officer, so I had a voice that can project if I needed to project, which is great. Welcome everybody. My name is Deland Jessop, and I'm an instructor with the School of Management at Lingera College. And I've been asked to come and MC this event for tonight. And before we even begin, I'd just like to recognize that we're on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people. We just want to thank them for welcoming us to host this event. Now, I'm done. Thank you. Kevin actually came and spoke at my school today. I think you're going to get a lot out of this presentation. I know my students did, kind of opened up their eyes, and some of you will be aware of the topic, and some of you might even get a little bit angry. Now, the reason we're all here, I guess I should speak for everybody, but the reason I'm here in particular, I'm deeply concerned about climate change. Okay? It's a major factor that none of us really want. Nobody here wants this to be happening, whether you're working, you don't want to be thinking that just working or taking trips with your kids and stuff like that is contributing to the potential destruction of the planet. No one wants to be thinking this. But it is a problem that we have to face. It's something that we have to accept. And I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm sure I don't have to talk to everybody here about the dangers of climate change. We're just starting now to see what the scientists have been screaming about for decades. We're starting to feel it. I feel horrible when my kids can't play outside this summer because they're literally choking on the smoke. It scares me to death when I read about forest fires that are taking place in the Arctic Circle. It really bothers me that cities in South Africa are actually going dry, and they're going to have to displace millions of people potentially. It's scary, frightening stuff. And the scariest thing about it in my mind is we really aren't doing anything about it. Okay? It's shocking. Canada has got this reputation in the world that we're excellent stewards of the land. Canada is one of the only countries that actually withdrew themselves from the Kyoto Accord. North America does not have a great record working with other countries to actually address this concern. And I started asking myself why. Part of the reason is none of us want this. I'm sure everybody in this room has read a report somewhere thinking, oh wow, it's not as bad as we thought. Great, I don't have to worry about this. Or, oh wait, there's a fix? You really want to believe that it's not an issue, but it is. So I started asking myself, well, why aren't the governments doing anything about this? And as a student of politics, I studied politics when I was younger, if any government that's in charge of Canada, if they have a majority, they can really do almost anything they want. They're elected dictators, they've got very few checks on their power of any policy they want to push through. Parliament actually reigns above the Supreme Court. So we could do something if we wanted to. So it's shocking that we're not. And when I read Kevin's book, I could only read it one chapter at a time because it literally made me angry as I was reading it. So I'd have to put it down and I was like, calm down, relax, think about the kids and all that. So it really kind of opened my eyes a little bit and kind of shocked me. But one of the things we have to realize is that we all have to work together on this. This should not be a partisan issue. I don't care if you lean right or lean left. This should not be a partisan issue. We have to address these problems. We have to work together to try and solve this. So I think you're going to find this presentation very, very interesting today. I witnessed it today and I was rather impressed with listening to Kevin. Before we begin, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Just everybody, can you please turn off your cell phones or put them on silent so they don't go beep or anything like that while they're speaking up here. Also, you're more than welcome to tweet or do anything you want with it. Just please try not to disturb anybody else around you. Kevin's going to speak. We're going to have another speaker, Claudia Casper. She's also going to be speaking as well. And then we're going to finish it up with a song by Bill Henderson, the former singer from the band Chilliwack. It's going to be a fun night. It's going to be a fun night. There's going to be a Q&A session afterward. If you have questions, please come up and ask them. There'll be somebody floating around with a microphone. Just put your hand up and come and give you the microphone. We just asked, you can't give speeches, okay? So ask questions. Academics. When I go to meetings, teachers love to hear themselves talk. So we'll be here all night. So no speeches. Ask the questions. Kevin's going to do his best to answer all the questions that come forward this way. Okay? Other than that, that's about it. So the first person that's going to come up is actually going to be Claudia Casper. A very nice lady. And she's an author. She wrote the Mercy Journals, which has just won the Philip K. Dick Award. And she's also the author of The Reconstructionist. The Reconstruction, which is now becoming a motion picture, actually. So it's kind of exciting. She's born and raised in Toronto, and what kind of impressed me most about her is she actually became a teacher at the Quality Polytechnic University. So she's not only doing what she loves doing, but she's also passing on to the next generation. So without further ado, Claudia, you want to come up and I'll hand the floor off to you.
Hello, I'm actually fresh from this weekend's TEDx Vancouver, where Kim Campbell gave a real barn burner of a speech about climate change. And so she's terrified, and we have to do something now. And it was really, really inspiring. She got a standing ovation. So I feel like we are maybe getting some momentum and dealing with it. As Kevin wrote, can you hear me? No.
Not very well.
All right, we'll stand closer. And just, that's good? Yeah.
Thank you.
As Kevin wrote in his preface, most writing on the impacts of global warming is by scientists, academics, or journalists. But tonight you're going to get something different. You're going to get a fiction writer and a politician. So it's going to be a little different. The theme underneath, I've written 3 novels, the theme underneath all my work has been evolution. My first novel, The Reconstruction, was about a woman who's hired by a museum to reconstruct a human ancestor based on the fossil find Lucy, so a 3 million year old ancestor. The significance of the Lucy find was that it showed that we evolved from a creature that had a brain the size of a chimpanzee but was already walking erect. And through writing that book, I asked myself and learned things about who we are and our place in the world, and our place among the animals. I think evolution, thinking about evolution and our evolution, places us in our ecological niche in time. My second novel was about reproduction and the gender conflict, as seen through the relationship between a father and a daughter. And in that book, I wanted to also explore the difference between the emotional experience of reproducing and having children and loving them, and the biological drives to reproduce. So it also was driven by thinking about evolution. My most recent book, The Mercy Journals, started with me wanting to explore whether we could ever evolve past the behavior of killing each other. In the book, what I do is I flipped the story of Cain and Abel, which was the story of the first murder in our cultural mythology, and envisioned a last murder. But this meant that I had to set the book in the future. And for me, I could not think about the future without climate change. So it became a post-climate change novel. So I spent 8 years researching climate change, thinking about it, gaming it out. So at the end of writing that book, I was asking myself the question, what kind of behavior do we need to evolve to deal with climate change? And I felt like what we'll need is to expand our pro-social behavior. So this is the behavior that comes from our ability to anticipate what someone else is thinking and feeling. So it's the root of empathy. It's called theory of mind, and so on. And it turns out that ability is one of the key things that was part of us evolving into the human beings we are today. So I think we're going to need to expand that ability that we already have. I'm sure, as Kevin will talk, to deal with global change, climate change. It's the first time as a species we're ever going to have to coordinate something globally. And we've never done that before. So there are going to be a lot of cultural shifts. I've watched the debate over political correctness and the flip with the alt-right and Trump. And I think of political correctness as a kind of enhanced good manners. It's really a step further, taking our culture and our society a step further into placing ourselves in what it feels like to be someone else and to receive what you're saying. And that's quite a complicated mental action. I'll be asking Kevin a little bit more about this after we listen to him speak. In my novel, The Mercy Journals, it's the story of Alan Quincy, who's an ex-soldier with severe PTSD in the year 2047. A slight note is that when I was writing this, I kept thinking like 2047 is much too early, and I explained that I'd sort of shrunk the time by at least 50 years. And it's turning out actually not so to be true. Anyway, Alan Quincy has survived his disorder the past 20 years by shrinking his world into the smallest possible existence. Into that world walks a woman wearing red shoes, and she takes the lid off his controlled life. So he begins writing these journals in order to survive. I'll read you 2 pages, so don't get antsy that I'm going to read like 2 chapters. March 9, 2047. My name is Alan Levy Quincy, age 58, born May 6, 1989, resident of Canton No. 3, formerly Seattle, Administrative Department of Cascadia. I sit at my kitchenette island in this quasi-medieval, wired by ration, post-nation-state world. My Beretta on my left, bottle of R&R whiskey on my right, speaking to the transcription program on my mobile. I was sober for so long, 18 years. I was sober through what seems to have been the worst of the die-off. 3.5 to 4 billion people dead of starvation, thirst, illness, and war, all because of a change in the weather. The military called it a threat multiplier. You break it, you own it. The old shopkeeper's rule. We broke our planet, so now we owned it. But the manual was only half written and way too complicated for anyone to understand. The winds, the floods, the droughts, the fires, the rising oceans, food shortages, new viruses, tanking economies, shrinking resources, wars, genocide. Each problem spawned 100 new ones. We finally managed to get an international agreement with stringent carbon emissions rules and coordinated plan to implement carbon capture technologies. But right from the beginning, the technologies either weren't effective enough or caused new problems, each of which led to a network of others. Within a year, the signatories to the agreement, already under intense economical and political pressure, were disputing who was following the rules, who wasn't, and who had the ultimate authority to determine non-compliance and enforcement. Despite disagreements, the international body made headway controlling the big things: coal generators, fossil fuel extraction, airplane emissions, reforestation, ocean acidification. But the small things got away from them: plankton, bacteria, viruses, soil nutrients, minute biochemical processes in the food chain. Banks and insurance companies failed almost daily. Countries went bankrupt. Treaties and trade agreements broke down. Refugees flooded borders. War and genocide increased. Violent conflict broke out inside borders. Yet most military forces refused to kill civilians. Nation-states collapsed almost as fast as species became extinct. Eventually, the international agreement on climate change collapsed, and the superpowers retreated behind their borders and bunkered down. The situation was way past 10 fingers, 11 holes. It was the chaos that ensues after people miss 3 meals and realize there's no promise of a meal in the future. Our dominion was over. A group of leaders, politicians, scientists, economists, religious and ethnic leaders, even artists, people with a vision, called a secret conference with the remaining heads of state and emerged with an emergency global government, agreed upon emergency laws and enforcement protocols. The new laws included a global one-child limit and a halt to all CO2 emissions. The provision of food and health care to as many people as possible was prioritized, along with militarily enforced peace, severe power rations, and further development of renewable energy. The agreement was for 1 year, but it's been renewed every year for the past 15. Why am I voicing all this? You already know it. I already know it. But I rehearse the events again and again, looking for what we could have done differently. There are so many things, so many ways we could have avoided most of the deaths. But really, were we ever going to act differently? I pour another drink. I drink it. I was sober through most of that history. I stayed sober when my ex-wife died of a deadly new variant of the hantavirus that had spread north. And I stayed sober when I took care of my sons. Sober, even though they acted like I was the volatile element in their lives, and looked only at each other when I spoke to them. When I left for work and listened at the door, they finally became animated and relaxed enough to be afraid of everything else in the world crashing down on them. I tried to be tender with them, to lay my hand on their heads, put an arm around their shoulders, but they'd wince or stay perfectly still. I was sober through all that, but now I'm drunk. So, as you can tell, it's a light, cheery book. I would like to say, though, I believe it's an optimistic novel. But now, to brighten the mood, I'm going to introduce Kevin Taft. Kevin Taft is a best-selling author, consultant, speaker, and former provincial politician in Alberta, Canada. From 1986 to 91, he was CEO of the Xterra Foundation, which mounted one of the history's largest paleontological expeditions in China's Gobi Desert, Alberta's Badlands, and the Canadian Arctic. He is the author of 5 books and many research studies and articles on political and economic issues in Alberta. He was an Alberta Liberal member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta from 2001 to 2012, and the leader of the official opposition from 2004 to 2008. His excellent new book, Oil's Deep State: How the Petroleum Industry Undermines Democracy and Stops Action on Global Warming in Alberta and in Ottawa, is fresh off the presses in paperback. Join me in welcoming Kevin Taft.
Thank you, Claudia. Can you hear me in the back all right?
Yep.
That's great. Super. If I fade out here, last night I talked so long the battery in the microphone went dead. If that happens, make sure either that I stop talking or that we get a new microphone.
Or just raise it up a bit. Raise it to your head, Kevin.
I'll be like a rock star, but you get better here. Well, that's good. That's good. How's that? Marginally better, that's great. So, Claudia, that was a formidable introduction. Thank you very much. You really set the stage here, left us with a lot to think about, and it's an amazing fit in some ways with what I'm going to talk about tonight. This question, as the character's having his whiskey with his gun on the table, wasn't that it? A Beretta on the table. Wondering what could we have done differently. That's the situation we're in right now that I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight. I want to thank initially the people who have organized this tour. I'm speaking at about 5 different, maybe more than that, several different events on the West Coast over the next few days. This tour, including tonight, is organized by volunteers, and these are people who because of their concern, take the extra step, put in the extra energy, and make events like this happen. And as I've said, it's events like this and people like the people who organize this tour who change the world. And tonight we're going to change the world just a tiny bit. You know, nobody's going to feel a great change, but it is through these processes that we build the future, whatever that future may be. And so I want to thank you, the volunteers, for putting this together tonight. I also want to thank all of you, that's a good crowd here, for coming out. You could have chosen to do lots of other things tonight. There's a number of very special people in the crowd. I'm not going to start identifying them all, but it's great to have have all of you here tonight. So as the slide says, welcome. Make sure we can get this to all work. The topic tonight, global warming and democracy. These are two ideas that don't necessarily come together right away in your head. Global warming and emissions, or global warming and wildfires or something come together. Democracy and politics, or democracy and money might fit together. But in fact, I'm going to lay out the case tonight that there's a profound connection between global warming and democracy. As Claudia has mentioned, my thinking on this that I'm going to present tonight largely comes out of the work I did on a book that was published about a year ago. There are copies out for sale out front, which I will sign, but this is not primarily a book tour. This is about building public awareness. I do have a background, not only helping organize expeditions searching for dinosaurs, which I used to joke when I was in the legislature qualified me to deal with the conservatives across the But I actually spent many years, I've lived almost my entire life in Edmonton, in fact in the same neighborhood where I grew up in Edmonton. My friends call me radically rooted, and I don't know if they mean that good or bad, but it's probably true. I spent many years in my early career working in and around government, which gave me an insight about how governments work from the kind of civil service and regulatory side. I then went and did a PhD in business, which people think means finance or marketing. I was actually way off on the fringes of organizational theory, looking at how society organizes itself to sustain mass consuming. And that trained me to think about social structures. And then through a process, my wife describes me as an accidental politician, which is pretty accurate. I ended up as a member of the legislature and with almost no experience as the leader of the opposition for 2 general elections. One we gained a bunch of seats, and then the next one we lost a bunch. That process put me in almost daily contact with the leadership of the oil industry in Alberta. Very impressive people, highly trained, driven kinds of people. Some of them became friends. I don't want to demonize these people, but I was certainly shown the muscle, the resource, the determination, the strategic thinking of the oil industry, and all of that came together to inform my thinking. So let's start with the first half of that topic, global warming, and I'm going to spend a few minutes tonight on the actual science of this because, as you will see a little bit later on, a lot of money and effort has been very deliberately spent to confuse the public on the science of global warming. That's a picture of my home. It's a picture of your home. It's a picture of the home of everybody you've ever known and everybody who's ever lived. As Carl Sagan called it, when you get a perspective from outer space, it's just a small blue dot. And wrapped around that dot is our atmosphere, which we are, with every breath we take, we are inhaling the atmosphere. And the atmosphere, the breathable part of it, is basically like a single sheet of paper wrapped around a basketball. And for the last couple of 100 years, we've essentially been treating that atmosphere like a sewer. Every time we send smoke up a chimney or up the tailpipe of a car or what have you, we don't pay anything for it, we don't treat it, it's just gone into the atmosphere. And we have been doing this on an increasingly immense scale since the beginning of industrialization. So today, September 10th, about 100 million barrels of oil will have been burned, and that will happen again tomorrow, happened yesterday, and 10 million tons of coal and 300 billion cubic feet of natural gas, day after day after day. So inevitably, when that all gets burned, and what we're doing there, what you need to understand, is that we're taking vast amounts of carbon that have been locked deep underground for tens and hundreds of millions of years, and we're bringing them up to the surface, and we're burning them in a geological blink of an eye. And when we burn them, all that emission produces, among many things, carbon dioxide. If you hate graphs, there's only 2 graphs in my presentation tonight. This is one, so you're already halfway through your pain. This is a graph put out by one of the major US scientific agencies, and it starts back about the year 1700, and it goes to about 2 weeks ago. And the shaded area is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This graph, if it went out that direction, it could go back 800,000 years. It could probably go back 8 million years. And the level of carbon dioxide wouldn't go up or down more than about 25 little marks there. It's at the beginning here, it's at about 270 parts per million. And it stays at that level. That's the level it had been at for way beyond human beings existed, long before we evolved. You begin to see an increase in the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it follows almost exactly as you would expect it would, the advance of industrialization. And so as we have burned more and more and more fossil fuels more and more rapidly, that concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere takes off, so that we are today, right now, breathing in over 400 parts per million CO2. Now, parts per million, I mean, that's pretty tiny, isn't it? Let me put this in perspective. Saturday night, maybe it was a good day, or maybe it was a good evening, and at supper time you said, I'm going to celebrate, I'm going to have a glass of wine. And you have one glass of wine. I'm not saying any of you did that, but hypothetically it could have happened. You had a glass of wine at supper, one glass of wine. Depending on your body mass and so on, in an hour, your blood alcohol level would be roughly 250 parts per million alcohol. Now let's say it had been an absolutely fabulous day, so you had 2 glasses of wine with supper. Well, your blood alcohol level is now going up well over 400 parts per million. And you can feel that. Your blood pressure changes, your nervous system is responding, your face might flush, you'll talk a little louder and feel a little, Well, what we've done with our carbon emissions is essentially give the atmosphere a second glass of wine, and it is beginning to behave differently. That's a picture of planet Earth using an ordinary camera, and the reason that it is behaving differently, the atmosphere is behaving differently, is because of this, which is infrared energy. This is a photo of planet Earth taken with an infrared camera, obviously from a satellite. Just to make it a little clearer, that's a Mercator projection. You can see the dark shaded areas, the dark red areas are where the most infrared energy comes out. Entirely natural. Planet Earth's hanging out there in space. It absorbs energy of all kinds from the sun and just kind of gently radiates it out as infrared. So the way I say it, if the hand of God was passing through that cold void of outer space and passed over planet Earth, God would think, that's just pleasantly warm. And that's why we can live here. But the problem we created is that infrared energy is absorbed by carbon dioxide. And it's exactly the same physics of microwaves. When you put that cup of coffee in your microwave oven and you hit 1 minute, those microwaves are at a wavelength that passes through the cup, which is why you can handle the cup, but is absorbed by the coffee, which is why the coffee gets hot. In the same way, the wavelength of infrared energy passes through the oxygen and nitrogen in the air, but is absorbed by the greenhouse gases. It's exactly the same physics, and it can be demonstrated 1,000 times over in lab conditions, and then we'll always get the same results. This is absolutely solid physics. We've added more CO2 to the atmosphere, so more infrared energy is absorbed, which means the CO2 and other greenhouse gases warm up. They share that warmth with the rest of the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is warming. This is the second graph. So if you hate graphs, we're nearly completely through the pain here. This is put out by NASA, the people who send astronauts up into space and usually bring them back safely. Starts at 1880, goes till last year, and these are measurements of the mean average temperature of the surface Earth. And there's some variation here because there are other factors affecting temperature, but you can see there's a clear upward trend in temperature, which is exactly what the science would forecast. In 1965, the Scientific Advisory Council to the US President, who in those days was Lyndon Johnson, presented a paper, and at that point, the core science of global warming had actually been being studied for well over a lifetime, going back to the 1890s. By 1965, this eminent group of scientists wrote this paper and spoke about humanity. They actually said mankind, but it's 1965, so political correctness, their manners are a little different. They were saying humanity is conducting an unwitting experiment with our atmosphere by burning fossil fuels and increasing the CO2 level. And in 1965, this group of scientists, among the most eminent in the world, forecast or predicted if we don't do something, you're going to have melting ice caps, you're going to have rising sea levels, more extreme weather, and serious dangers to humanity. President Johnson, to his credit, made this report public. So that just gives you a sense, 50-some years ago, this science was already starting to firm up. Couple of points for you to understand. I just want to make sure I've got the slides in the right order here. The reason I've spent a few minutes on the science, and not just to help it get clear in your mind, but for you to drive home a couple of points for you here. Carbon dioxide is a very, very stable molecule. It does not break down easily. It stays in the atmosphere for centuries. So the carbon dioxide that came out of your car, if you drove down here tonight, came out of the tailpipe of your car, most of it will still be in the atmosphere for 500 years from now. So what that means is we cannot cheat the laws of physics. We can't cut our emissions in half and think that we got this issue solved. We have to reduce emissions to zero. Think about that for a minute. Zero. We have to stop using coal and gasoline and natural gas and so on. And clearly the implication of that is then the fossil fuel industry needs to be phased out. Now when I say that in Alberta, there's often an audible gas. That's right. Now I'm not saying shut down the oil sands. Tomorrow people who disagree with me will say, oh, Taft, you want to shut down the oil sands. We can't do that. We've programmed our whole life around fossil fuels, but over the next couple of decades, we need to get past using fossil fuels. And if we don't, the consequences will be the kind of world that Claudia wrote about. Well, the industry's known this for, well, I mean, they could read in 1965. They're very bright, scientific people in many regards. So I spend a fair bit, several pages in my book, just drawing out evidence about what the industry knew and when they knew it. And this is one example. This is from the American Petroleum Institute, 1980. And I describe this particular report being presented in a little bit of detail. It was a boardroom in LaGuardia Airport. Big boardroom table surrounded by oil executives from different American oil companies, some of them with operations in Canada, and their own scientists reporting to them. And notice the term there, scientific consensus. That kind of phrasing turns up over and over because the science at its core is so clear. And I use this quote for the slides because it ends with a particularly shocking line. These scientists are saying to the American Petroleum Institute that if we don't do anything, by later in the 21st century, there will be, and that's their phrase, not mine, globally catastrophic effects. Again, Claudia, your novel is prescient. So the industry knew this, and at that point I try to picture what was the mood like in that room at that time. How does it feel to be told your industry be doing this. The industry had, they had actually been doing research, very good research, through the 1970s and through the 1980s. And they teamed up with government agencies and universities, and they knew what the science was, and they also understood its implications. And they had a choice to make. The implications were, clearly, and this is, again, from an internal Exxon document that's being made public through legal investigations. Clearly, this means we're going to have to reduce and then eliminate the use of fossil fuels. The industry understood that. And then they had a decision to make. They could have decided in 1982 or 84 or whenever, you know what, we're a scientific organization because the oil industry is heavily scientific. We accept the science, and we are going to start redefining ourselves from being fossil fuel companies to being energy companies, and we're going to transition towards solar and wind and other renewables. That's unfortunately not what happened. What they did instead was double down on fossil fuels, and they set off on a hyper-cynical campaign to subvert the public understanding of this issue. So that sets up then what I describe as a collision with democracy, and you can pick various dates for the point of impact. I choose 1992. I look around here, some of you like me are old enough to remember, you might remember the Rio Earth Summit. Does that mean anything to anybody here? Yeah. A lot of Canadians went. It was actually chaired. The Secretary General of it was a Canadian named Morris Strong. It was the largest gathering of heads of state in history till that time. Over 100 heads of state, tens of thousands of other people traveled to Rio de Janeiro to come together as humanity, as people occupying a globe. And among other treaties, because there were a few signed there, all the countries who attended eventually signed and ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which committed them in 1992 to reducing emissions, which of course meant reducing the use of fossil fuels, which set up the collision with the oil industry, because the oil industry began, and you can track this through the records, and I write about it, to strike back without relent. So we'll get to part 2, democracy. And I spoke at the beginning about volunteers, and to give you a sense of how special the volunteers are, you're going to be envious here. I'm having a sip of tea, delivered by a volunteer in an old-fashioned thermos. Thank you. So what is democracy? Well, there's countless definitions of it. I chose this one. It's poetic, it's succinct, and in an era of Donald Trump, it reminds us that from time to time there have been really great people occupying the White House, not just, I don't even know what adjectives to use to describe it anymore. Democracy, essentially, government of the people, by the people, for the people. If you have never read the Gettysburg Address, or if you haven't read it in a long time, you probably haven't, we are Canadians, it's not part of our history directly, I suggest you Google it. It's about 700 words long. You can read it in 4 minutes. It's a fabulous, fabulous piece of writing that Abraham Lincoln, I believe, sketched out on a piece of paper on his way to speak at this site of this terrible battle. So government of the people, by the people, for the people. Of course, and let me pause for a second. It's a radical idea. Most of history, almost all of history, there has not been democracy like we live in. Including, in that time, even Abraham Lincoln's side of democracy was not very democratic. If you were female, if you didn't own land, and if you were black or of different races. The achievement of democracy is very recent, it's very special, and I think all of us tonight would agree it's worth fighting for. What makes it possible? Well, there are lots of ways to come at this. I chose to focus on the institutional side of it. What we need for democracy to happen is a lot more than voting every so often, and there's an election underway here in BC. We need a whole series of autonomous democratic institutions. What do I mean by that? I mean organizations that have at their core some version of a public interest that are well defined by some rules and regulations and traditions. So an example, something I had for several years, an opposition party. An opposition party actually has there are laws, there's procedures, there's all kinds of things that define the institution of an opposition party. Just like there are the same things defining a governing party. What about the courts? Well, we got a sense of how important the courts are a couple of weeks ago. And one of the important things there is that the court stands apart, so that Justin Trudeau could not phone up the judges of the Federal Court of Appeal and say, I think you better rule this way. The courts are autonomous. The civil service is supposed to be nonpartisan, professionals who again have a whole series of rules so that they're not taking money from the side to sell out to private interests. Regulators are supposed to be arm's length from political meddling as well as from industries. Universities, the media, you have all these different institutions, all with their own roles, all with some public democratic role at their core. And through a very messy process, I think it was Churchill who talked about democracy was like making sausages. You don't want to see how it happens, but the result is pretty tasty. Through all this counterbalancing and debate and clashing of ideas, the notion is that the best ideas will gradually survive the test, and we will end up with the kind of free, prosperous society that we have. And what's crucial about it is that at its core are citizens. It's always a little bit of a moment of suspense because each computer has graphic software that rearranges this image. This is the way I wanted it to be. So you see the sense here of the different institutions around the outside and at its core, at their core, citizens. And there could have been rings and rings of those institutions, professional bodies and you name it, all kinds of police forces and the military and so on. If this were an image, just to help make this a little bit real for you, if I was trying to portray this as Russia, you would have a governing party and an opposition party and all of those other institutions, but at its core would be Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs, who directly meddle in all of those institutions. And we could apply that kind of imagery to any number of other contrasting ways of governing. But we are human beings and we have our failings. And from time to time our institutions break down. You think of the Senate scandal a few years ago, or all kinds of controversies. Sometimes these institutions which are supposed to be committed to the public interest are actually captured. And there's a long literature on regulatory capture and institutional capture and even state capture. Sometimes the people in these institutions end up forgetting that they're there to serve the public and instead end up serving private interests. So, there's so many examples of Health Canada. Health Canada has a branch that approves drugs and medications. And we count on that branch being independent from the drug companies. We count on that. From time to time, there are concerns and scandals that maybe the influence of the drug companies there is a little bit excessive. Or, I'm not sure this is lighthearted or not. All of us probably have cell phones. I have one in my pocket. The cell phone regulator is supposed to be protecting our interests, but when I pay that bill every month and I realize I'm paying some of the highest cell phone bills in the world, I kind of think, well, maybe the regulator's actually looking after TELUS and Rogers and Bell better than they're looking after me. Those would be examples of capture. My argument, which I'll back up with all kinds of evidence, is that in Canada, the most extreme case is Alberta. Same dynamics are underway in BC. Key public institutions have been captured to substantial degrees by the oil industry, which means that the interest of the oil industry in increasing production and profits has overtaken the public interest of preventing those globally catastrophic effects of climate warming. And I take it a step farther. Now, the term deep state, since Donald Trump has been in office, has got sort of torqued, like everything else in his world, into a sort of paranoia conspiracy theory. It's actually a term with quite a long history and some significant writing on it. And I just take that a little bit further. This is where I bring my inherent egg-headedness gets away from me sometimes. So I actually develop a little bit of a theory of the deep state in here. And I argue that a deep state actually arises when several institutions are all captured and held for an extended period by the same private interest. And in that case, then the counterbalancing starts to break down. So the regulator is no longer not only not counterbalancing the industry, the regulator is not being counterbalanced by the civil servants who might be blowing a whistle on the regulator, but they aren't. And they're not being counterbalanced by the governing party because the governing party is actually so heavily influenced by the oil industry that it's put the interest of the oil industry first. And not only that, the opposition party, whose role is to challenge and to oppose, is also in the pocket, as we can develop with the oil industry. And when a whole series of institutions are captured and held by the same private interest, then the ability of democracy to function properly is impaired. And we end up with a state within a state, a deep state. So we have the appearance of democratic functioning. We still go out and vote, as we should. We still have a governing party. We still have an opposition party. We still have a regulator. But when it comes to the interests of the oil industry, those institutions are not serving our public interest. So this would be just a variation on that previous graphic. And now, I am going to take my turn and read a couple of passages from the book to try to make this theory a little bit real for you. One of the wonderful things about living in a democracy like Canada is that when there's a trial in court, the evidence presented is public. So this book starts with a trial. It starts with a trial that was held in Ottawa just a very few years ago of a character named Bruce Carson. And if you Google Bruce Carson, it might be confusing because it turns out he's been on trial several times. This particular trial was for illegal lobbying, and he was found guilty. Bruce Carson, trained as a lawyer, rose up. He worked many years in the Conservative caucus in Ottawa. He came very close with Stephen Harper. The day that Stephen Harper was sworn in as Prime Minister, Bruce Carson took his desk in the Prime Minister's office as a senior advisor to the Prime Minister. He worked there for a couple of years, then left Ottawa and took up a position at the University of Calgary, heading up an institute there, and also heading up an organization, a front organization for the industry called the Energy Policy Institute of Canada, EPIC. And from that position, he began lobbying back into the federal government, and that's how he was charged and ultimately found guilty of lobbying. The documents in that trial opened a window, a little window, but a very deep one, into the backroom operations of the oil industry. And I'm just going to read you a passage from this to give you a sense of this. So EPIC, Energy Policy Institute of Canada. It's not clear when the idea to form EPIC was hatched, but it did not materialize out of thin air. Interest with serious intent and deep pockets pushed into being. When its founding meeting was held on August 13th, 2009, a 20-page package of sophisticated bylaws was presented, which defined, among other things, the role of a strategic advisory board, and named Douglas Black as president. Douglas Black was subsequently appointed as a senator by Stephen Harper. And Thomas Taquino, some of you may know that name, he was the head of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, and Bruce Carson, the actual man on trial, as co-chairpersons. The minutes for the meeting, obtained by police, noted that a preliminary budget of $2.9 million was reviewed. It was felt this would be reasonable, but it was noted further review would occur. The minutes give no indication of who prepared the budget or where the $2.9 million would come from. At the meeting, Bruce Carson and Thomas Taquino were awarded honoraria of $60,000 per year, and Douglas Black was appointed president for a 2-year term at $10,000 a month. EPIC's founding charter was finalized a month later on September 9th, 2009, so exactly 9 years ago yesterday. In an interview with RCMP during their investigation, Taquino explained that, quote, EPIC's goal was to develop an energy strategy for Canada, end quote. This was a goal of remarkable ambition. EPIC and its backers, primarily the oil industry, were not lobbying to change a particular policy or get support for a specific project. They were not looking for a tax break or a change in environmental standards. Their goal was to do something that would be led by national governments in other democracies. Develop an energy strategy, oil, gas, coal, electricity, nuclear, pipelines, renewables, for all of Canada. In effect, EPIC was founded with the ambition of capturing the energy policy of a nation, with the oil industry de facto in a privileged position. I then proceed from there to give real examples with characters and names, some of which you would recognize, I'm sure, about how that actually played out. But rather than reading a passage from that, I'm going to go back to a period earlier. The first part of my presentation on global warming. I told you that I spent a few minutes on that because so much money and effort has been spent to confuse the public. I want to let you know tonight how deliberate and strategic that process has been. I'm going to tell you a little story here. I can wander sleep. So I pick up this copy. I call this copy of my book Chelsea. You might well wonder why, and there is a story. The book was released just under a year ago, and we had booked a large room in Edmonton. We were expecting 200 people, and there had been a delay at the printer. So the day of the book launch arrives. I haven't seen the book. This is a problem. But I know it's been shipped, and it's arrived at Audrey's Books in Edmonton, which is the largest independent bookstore. So about noon, I race downtown. I walk in the doors, and there's the clerk is behind the counter, mussing around with a book, and I go up to the counter. Those who know me know I can get a little twitchy and impatient, and I say, "Hi, I'm looking for a copy of a book that's just out called Oil's Deep State." And the clerk says, I'm just unpacking it right now. And I said, "Can I see a copy?" And he said, "Sure." And he hands me a copy. Now this is my fifth book. Claudia, you might be able to identify with this. Every book, when you first see it, is like a newborn baby. It's the most beautiful book in the world. And he hands this to me, and I'm thinking, this is gorgeous. This is going to win the Nobel Prize. And my eyes glaze over, and I'm just sort of lost. And finally, I look up at the clerk, and he's looking at me really strangely. And I say, I wrote this book. My name's Kevin Taft. And he said, "Well, that's nice. We'll give you 10% off." So he did. I bought it 10% off. First ever copy of the book ever sold. So this is going to, I'm sure it will be worth untold fortunes as it climbs out of the future. I go that night to the book launch, it goes really well. There's a lineup of people afterward to buy them, and I'm signing them to Tom, Dick, and Harry, and whoever. And this young woman comes to the front, and I say, who would you like it signed to? And she says, to Chelsea. So I said, great. You know, I'm all excited, to Chelsea, C-H-E-L-S-E-A. And as soon as I write the A, she says, no, it's a Y. So I'm stuck. Now I cannot give her a copy of the book with the name misspelled. So I take that very first one, the most beautiful one, happened to be the one I brought with me, and I wrote it out to Chelsea and I gave it to her. And that means now I've got a copy spelled out to Chelsea. The next 3 or 4 book readings, I would start off, is there anyone named Chelsea here? Because I've got a book for you. But now I've grown quite fond of it, and it's pretty dog-eared. So, anyways, here we go. Now I'm going to read a different passage, which is much less amusing than that story. This goes back to some very good work done by, we talk about institutions and democracies. This is very good work done by the New York Times investigative team. And it is a copy of the American Petroleum Institute. So you remember an earlier slide, the one where they talked about globally catastrophic effects. That was the American Petroleum Institute in 1982, I think it was, or 1980. This is now reflecting the change of mind. They came up when they decided they were going to ignore their scientists. They said, well, we have to come back with our own counter-campaign. And they came up with a communications strategy, which they call the Global Climate Science Communications Action Plan. And the New York Times got its hand on this. Now, this was written 20 years ago, but to give you a sense of the power of this, how many of you heard somebody say, well, you know, the science isn't really settled yet? Yeah, okay. All right. So this is still very relevant. I'm just going to skip over a couple of paragraphs, but the plan's very detailed. Remember, the oil industry can hire the finest communications people on the planet. As part of its plan, API, the American Petroleum Institute, had commissioned a study of public opinion that found most Americans thought, quote, climate change to be a great threat. But also found that if they were told that scientists did not think the evidence was clear, then a majority would come to oppose, in this case, the Kyoto Treaty. So you remember the Kyoto Treaty flowed out of the Rio Earth Summit, and it was supposed to be ratified and implemented, and it never was by either Canada or the US. So this is the industry fighting the Kyoto campaign, but their fight is carried on. Victory will be achieved, says the plan, when those promoting the Kyoto Treaty on the basis of science appear to be out of touch with reality. Now, that's a bizarre, frightening sentence, but it's right out of their plan. Reality, it seems, would be turned into fantasy, and fantasy into reality. The strategies and tactics of the plan included recruiting scientists, quote, who do not have a long history in the climate change debate, end quote, just who you want, right? To use as commentators sowing doubt on the global warming science. They would be supported by media information kits and orchestrated campaigns producing, quote, steady streams of letters to the editor, op-ed columns, workshops, and paid advertising on scientific uncertainties. I guarantee everybody in this room unknowingly has read an op-ed or a letter to the editor or something else written that's flowed out of this kind of campaign. And that was just the beginning. A global climate science data center would be set up in Washington, D.C. as a nonprofit educational foundation staffed with professionals on loan from corporations to become a one-stop shop for members of Congress, the media, industry, and all others concerned. This was to be augmented by a, quote, national direct outreach and education plan to educate members of Congress, state officials, industry leadership, and school teachers and students about the uncertainties in climate science. I'm skipping over a little bit more, but that gives you a sense of how deliberate and how cynical this all was. American Vice President Al Gore had played a central role in assembling the initial Kyoto Treaty and was dismayed when it was not ratified by the president. When Clinton's term was over, Gore ran for president against George W. Bush in the 2000 election. In an exceedingly close and controversial vote, which all of you will remember, Bush defeated Gore. Bush, a former governor of Texas, ushered in a flourishing 8 years for the fossil fuel industry, accompanied by an unprecedented climb in atmospheric carbon dioxide and a string of the warmest years ever recorded to that date. And of course, that trend has just continued. You know, I'm going to stop reading there. But that, I hope that gives you a sense of what's been going on. So let's move on. My first reading was from 10 years ago. That reading was from 20 years ago, although it's still playing out. Let me give you a reading from just last year. And then we'll move towards the end here. This landed in my inbox in late July 2017, sent by an academic at the University of Alberta named Claudia Casper, and Lori said, take a quick dig into this, and I did. And then I phoned up my publisher and said, I want to at least add a couple of paragraphs to the end as an addendum, and the book, it was too late. I couldn't do that. It's not exactly a best-selling title, but when you dig into it, it's quite stunning what it proposes, what CAP, the Canadian Industry of Petroleum Producers, is proposing. They're proposing a whole-of-government approach. Now that's a term, some of you in government might have heard that term. It's when you want literally all of government on side. Whatever your initiative is, it's bigger than one or two departments, it's for the whole of government. I'm going to guess that the BC Olympics were managed by a whole of government approach. I'm just speculating, but they would have had transportation, building a highway up to Whistler, and they would have had finance, and they would have had municipal affairs, and tourism and economic development, and education, the program in the schools, all of that. That's a whole of government approach. That's what the oil industry is pushing for here. And they want it guided. In fact, they use the term oversight. They want oversight of the whole of government approach to be done by a committee in which they are sitting right at the table. So picture this big boardroom, the bunch of seats around the table. Industry and Government Oversight Committee, and they name the people who will be there. Several representatives of the oil industry, the Premier of Alberta, key ministries which they identify, and then the Alberta Energy Regulator, which in best practice should actually be arm's length from all of this. In reality, in Alberta, it's actually chaired by an oil executive. And you probably haven't heard of the Alberta Energy Regulator, but it affects your lives every day. It's one of the largest energy regulators in the world because Alberta's oil sands are the third largest oil reserve. And so how that oil sand is developed is handled by the regulator. Then they go on. They want to engage this way with the federal government, with the NEB, another regulator which you've all heard of because they're so involved with pipelines, and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. And the purpose of this oversight committee is to ensure policy and regulatory changes that protect and enhance the investment climate for the petroleum industry. What? So this is laid out, black and white. This is, as I read it, I realized, well, this is, I'd already read the book, but this is the organizational chart for oil's deep state. And this shows the oil industry is not treating government or viewing government the way you and I view government. They're treating government as if government is just a partner with them, and sometimes a kind of junior and rather irritating partner. They are effectively the backing government when we come to this point. So between the two of us, Claudia and me, we really thoroughly depressed you. There is hope. I don't know if there's hope in your novel. Oh, totally, okay. There is hope for all of us. That's why we're out here tonight. If we didn't have hope, we'd be home drinking whiskey. Listen, I don't want to glorify any large organization, but a number of them around the world are getting with the program. Google, massive consumer of power, 2010, no non-renewables. By last year, 100% non-renewables. Apple, Facebook, and so on are following suit. Companies like Walmart and IKEA and so on are all starting to get with the program, eliminating or reducing the use of fossil fuels. I think the big game changer is that second point there. It's not going to play out as rapidly in Canada, but starting this next model year, as in a few months from now, every major car company in the world is starting to roll out full lines of electrical vehicles. 70% of Canada's oil exports are used in transportation fuel. So that market starts to shrink, which puts the industry into a crisis, but it's exactly what we need to do. The electrical system is less of an issue in BC because they have so much hydro, but in most of the world, electrical systems are coal-fired power. Ontario eliminated coal power plants. Alberta, I give Rachel Notley credit on this. Her government has accelerated that process. In the United States, we're seeing greening of the electrical grid. Britain, the original coal burner, that graph in the first half of the 1800s, when you started to see CO2 climb between 1800 and 1850, that was Britain, burning coal. Today, it's not uncommon for the entire British electrical grid to run without any coal. So things are happening. California is leading the way. China is probably going to set the global agenda on this. There's a huge transition underway in China, Germany, Scandinavian countries, and so on. So there is lots of hope there. There are ways we can all make a difference, starting with our own personal lives. We can change the way we live. We need to begin reprogramming our lives to get away from using fossil fuels. That means we travel differently, it means we eat differently, we find different sources of protein. It means we heat our homes differently, and we can talk about that. I live in a house in Edmonton. This might confirm that I'm crazy, but I live in a house in Edmonton that doesn't have a furnace. And it's really quite comfortable. At a community level, my advice to you is to talk about this issue. Get angry, turn it into a moral issue, raise concerns with your colleagues, raise concerns at the dinner table. When you're sitting in public transit and your eyes are burning from the smoke from the forest fires, talk to the strangers beside you and say, this is wrong. We have to stop doing what we're doing. Turn this into a moral issue. There was a time when slavery was just economics. There was nothing immoral about slavery. It got turned into a moral issue. Women's rights got turned into a moral issue. We need to turn the use of fossil fuels into a moral issue. And you can do that through conversation. I borrowed this idea from a thin book written by an American scholar named Timothy Snyder. He wrote it less than a year after Donald Trump was elected, and he was just so alarmed with what was happening. The book's called On Tyranny. I think it's 20 lessons in how to defend democracy. One of them, and I chose this one because I worked so much with institutions in this presentation, is defend an institution. Stand up for those very things that make democracy possible. It might be supporting Vancouver City Council when they actually take a pipeline to court, or the Council of Burnaby. That's an institution taking a courageous stand, and believe you me, they are under a lot of pressure from the oil industry back now. Or a union, or a First Nation, or a school agency. Choose an institution and write them a letter, get involved, go to a meeting, give them some backbone so that they can stand up for what's right. And finally, you might want to get involved in politics. I think there are some people here tonight who are involved in politics. in the end, this is a political process. So you might want to write the Prime Minister or the Premier or the leader of the opposition party, even if the opposition party has a view you disagree with. Tell them. Don't just mutter about it. Tell them. Go to a meeting. Speak up. You may want to volunteer on a campaign. Someday you may even want to run for office. It can happen, and it can be very exciting. Win and lose. So I will wrap up with that. I hope at this point you have a sense of how global warming and democracy are in fact linked. And when we are standing up and fighting to save the planet from the perils of global warming, we are also standing up and fighting for democracy. And believe me, they're both worth fighting for. Thank you very much.
I'm going to start off the questions with a couple of questions for you. And I kept changing the order of which ones I was going to ask as you kept talking. I think I'm going to ask number 4 first. What do you think people like the Koch brothers and some of the big oil executives that you've been dealing with, what do you think their thinking is going to happen? So is it an Elysium-like world where the rich are insulated and the rest suffer? What are they thinking?
Did everybody hear that? Yeah. You know, I can only speculate on that. I didn't ever meet the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers are 2 of the wealthiest men on the planet who are, I see lots of heads nodding. They're central, actually, to this whole campaign of disinformation. I don't know what they're thinking. I do know that I met any number of senior people in the oil industry, some of whom were extremely wealthy, worth hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. And these were bright, intelligent people. And I look back and I just find myself wondering, what are they thinking? I do remember one conversation with a fellow who was trying to be supportive, saying, you know, Kevin, I'm wealthy enough that I'm going to be, I mean, this is virtually what he said, I'm going to be able to look after myself and my family, but I'm concerned. He said, I am concerned about the rest of the world. But he just kept on doing the same thing. So, Claudia, I think some of them can engage in a kind of psychological insulation where they just don't face up to reality. The pain of that dissonance is too profound, and they couldn't live with the cognitive dissonance, so they choose to stay doing what they've done historically, and we have to confront them. Just so people know, while Claudia and I are having a couple of questions, I think there's some process for you to collect your thoughts and come to a microphone here.
Exactly. So next question. Nation states, as we know them, have existed for about 200 years. When you think about our political system, how do you imagine it changing to meet the challenges of climate change?
That's, boy, these are great questions.
Sorry.
No. I think you hinted at this in your introductory comments. And I like the way you set up the conflict between countries, who was cheating and who wasn't. This is a global problem, so we could all live with 0 carbon emissions. We could all be...
The EU is like a little mini practice.
You know, the EU is a wonderful example of something like that. We'll have to develop. The flip side of this is that if it isn't developed, it's a disaster. So that, you know, we might be a little late getting to the party. We already are, but we will make this happen.
Okay, last question, then we're turning it over. We want some formerly known as Kinder Morgan pipeline gossip. What do you think is going to happen with that situation? To me, it is our first sign of climate change conflict.
Yes.
Because you have 2 different interests in 2 different areas, and it's all about money and economics.
Yeah.
And we can't just ignore Alberta. So I'm really,
Yeah.
in a problem-solving kind of way, do you have any sense of where that would go.
What I would like our governments to be doing is to be facing up to this reality. Ideally, Justin Trudeau would have stood up on that day, whenever it was that he announced that citizens of Canada would buy this pipeline, and would have said, we decided we will not buy this pipeline. We're going to take the $4.5 billion and invest it in a transition plan to get away from fossil fuels. He had that on. So, and without that planning, it's going to be a much harder crash, and it's going to be the hardest crash of all for the place I live, Alberta, because as those car industries and so on move away from the use of our product, the market will disappear, and there will be a very rude awakening for Alberta. In terms of gossip around the pipeline, I have no gossip. If I have to speculate realistically, boy, I think there is a distinct possibility that the federal government will respect the federal court ruling and work their way through the steps laid out in that ruling to go through the appropriate consultations with First Nations and to deal with the marine traffic. And then they can say, well, we met the conditions of the ruling, we're proceeding. And at that point, I will not be surprised if there is significant civil disobedience. And I've asked this question now to myself for a long time, and I wrote a column in National Observer about it, wondering, have Rachel Notley and Justin Trudeau thought this through? Are they prepared to send in the army? And I asked the question, and it's a deeply troubling question, are they prepared to have people killed in order to build a pipeline? And it could come down to that. And I don't know how that will play out.
Okay, so the questioning's now over. This lovely woman will run the microphone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taft. That's marvelous work that you're doing, and we all appreciate it. I'm Tim Takaro. I'm a professor at Simon Fraser. I study health sciences and work at the interface of research and health impacts of climate change. My question is about the National Energy Board that follows on your answer. What is the National Energy Board's relationship to industry, and why did that not get addressed in the court ruling?
I'm not a lawyer, so I'm only guessing here about the court ruling. I think in the appeal cases that were filed, the NEB's independence, am I right in this? When I read the court ruling, I don't remember the independence of the NEB being a particular point of contention. The NEB it's a fraught relationship with the industry, let me put it that way. When Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, Stephen Harper's power base was the fossil fuel industry. And they brought through changes to the NEB that rearranged that institution so that it was designed more and more to facilitate the development of the oil sands in particular. Not just any oil, but the oil sands in particular, which are so vast. And so it was like engineering DNA. The organizational DNA of the NEB was rearranged so that it became an institution intended to facilitate the development of the oil sands. Then they got further trapped up in their actual activities when on a number of occasions there were either people hired or there were meetings, people were hired from the oil industry, or there were meetings, sometimes secret, that were then exposed later between the NEB officials and people from the industry. So it's that's a little bit of background on it. The legislation around the NEB is being overhauled. We'll see how that plays out, though. That's the best answer I can give you right now. I don't know if it's very satisfactory. Where's our mic lady here?
Right here.
Oh, okay.
Hi there. So I've got a bit of a unique perspective. Former Edmonton Riverview resident and voter, at least one of your campaigns.
Thank you.
Recently moved from Edmonton. In fact, I grew up in Sherwood Park, where all the refineries are. Recently moved to Burnaby Mountain. So, while I have many families still back in Edmonton, I'm very much a West Coaster. In fact, I was born in BC. My question for you is not related to my history, but it's related to SFU. So here we are at a beautiful SFU auditorium.
Can you put it closer to the mic? Closer?
Yeah, sorry. Question about SFU. SFU is one of the, I would call hypocrite organizations who seem to promote climate change initiatives, yet refuse to divest. I understand they have significant investments in fossil fuels and have done nothing to divest. What is your message for this institution around divestment?
Well, I think this is a case where an institution should be challenged, where I talked earlier about defending an institution, pressing from the inside or from the outside or whatever direction you can for SFU to pull its investments, whether those are, I don't know what kind of investments they are, endowment funds or whatever, pull them out of the fossil fuel industry. And a number of major universities have done this. I think Stanford has, and it's a growing movement worldwide. That would be a good example to the public, and it would also, in my sense, might well be a wise long-term investment strategy. So go for it. Try to get involved on with the Board of Governors or the financial office that's making those decisions, and turn this into an issue and recapture or retake the institution so that it's serving the public interest. So,
Yeah, good answer.
I guess I'll stand for this one. I'm looking around, I see lots of senior gray hairs, I would say. So I'm representing a generation here as well, coming from the book, where the individual was born in 1998. Myself was born in 1988, so I guess I'm a little more within the individual's book and such. But I'm part of a generation that will be eventually assuming the governance of the country. Right now we're ruled majority by the baby boom generation, which we could say we pride themselves on liberalism. The foundations of liberalism being free market economy and limited government and intervention in state affairs. So if I'm piecing together your theory that's giving us hope sort of towards global warming and such, if we see ourselves that we're a proud liberal country, liberalism that is,
Yes,
country,
yeah.
does this mean that we have to transition potentially to a socialist country where we have state intervention and state ownership, actually regulating the economy and controlling?
yeah, I'm not, listen, I think the free market has to be very carefully controlled and managed. I think we have way too much confidence in free market. You are raising, or I'll open the door, you sort of push it open and crack, I'll push it wide open. In the medium to long term, we have to question the whole nature of capitalism and of consumerism. We cannot, it's just basic logic, you cannot have infinite growth in a finite space. And so that, we're starting to bump into that reality, and it's going to pose some really big challenges for your generation. And you guys can rise up to that. Okay, next.
My name is Elizabeth Lee, and I lived in Alberta for many years. I'm a BCer, but I loved it. And I lived in Fort McMurray, and it was the happiest time of my life. But what I discovered working in all the different industries and in a stakeholder industry called SEMA, that first of all, the mining, not the mining industry, industrialization itself is, but especially mining, is incestuous. They always have somebody they know. They don't really go and get somebody that's got all the hoops and whistles that they would meet, they get somebody that they're familiar with, and that's part of it. And secondly, besides Kinder Morgan and the pipeline, my passion is for sightsee up in the Peace. And that industry lobbied long before the NDP got into power.
Yeah.
So when the NDP went to Ottawa to talk about stopping the sightsee, they were bombarded. And what it is that industry has got to hold, it doesn't matter where it's mining, it's agriculture, but industrialization of finite resources like water,
Yes.
right, is the same as what oil does to the water or bitumen does to the water. And we do not have democracy there. There is no democracy, and our systems must change, and our legal systems must change. Because sitting in the courtroom, I saw a whole lot of That's my question. How do you see that going about? That means our democracy and our legal systems and our institutions do not work because we are where we are because of it. There is no democracy or freedom in that. Okay?
Okay, that's a big question. I think we have to accept a few things here. Life is a contest. You know, nobody's always going to win. We're certainly not. The group in this room, we're not going to win all that often. It's a struggle. And it's a collision of many different forces. So, and it's a constant. It's a constant effect throughout all of history. It's the nature of being human. How do we make our society more democratic? You talked about failed institutions. I am not going to concede that they're completely failed. I think the courts, for example, they demonstrated their value. And I spent some time reading that court ruling, and it's a pretty impressive piece of work. But you're, in many ways, just confirming my point. We have to work. We have to, and our friends and neighbors have to work to reclaim democracy. And it's a struggle. It's not going to happen unless we are unrelenting and unless we spread our efforts. And sometimes it happens at the most unexpected moments. But listen, let's stop and get to some other questions. I could go on way too long here. Maybe we should just put a limit on, should we say maybe 4 more questions or something like that? Or, I don't know, I'm not running that, but 3 more? Okay.
I too am a transplant from Alberta, 21 years in BC and would never go back. I live on Burnaby Mountain as well. I have read a lot of documentation that says if that tank farm expands and there's ever a fire, thousands of us will be evacuated, and God knows when we come home again. I have a comment that I'd like you to comment on. I repeatedly hear this phrase, meaningful consultation. I'm also aware that there's supposed to be prior informed consent for First Nations. So what I'm reading in meaningful consultation is that the oil and gas industry is just going to talk at people till we accept what they want. Yeah. Comment.
Okay, so if that's all they do, then I would expect the court to say that's not good enough. And the court actually, the notion of consultation is being developed through a series of court rulings. Again, I will say I'm not a lawyer. And First Nations have rights to consultation that the rest of us don't have because of the nature of, in parts of Canada, of the treaties they signed, or because of the fact that they were here first. And we took the land from them. So consultation becomes meaningful when there is a serious effort undertaken to accommodate it by whoever's proposing a project. So where the court said the consultation was inadequate is when the industry would sit down, or the NEP would sit down with First Nations and say, tell us your concerns, and they'd write all the concerns down, and they'd put them in a file and say, well, we've consulted. And the court said, no, you haven't. what you have to do is listen to those concerns and then make a serious effort to address them. So one of the bands, the pipeline goes through their main source of water. And the band said, please reroute the pipeline. And the industry made no effort, they made no study. They made note of that, didn't change anything about it, and called it consultation. The court said, no, that's not consultation. You have to not only make a serious effort to accommodate concerns, if you do not accommodate them, you have to give a very good reason why. So the courts have set some pretty good standards around what meaningful consultation is. I
But
think we should move on.
is no ever an option?
Yes. Well, is no ever an option? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
No
First Nation.
pipeline. No pipeline.
The First Nations, it's very clear they do not have a veto over this. So the oil industry, if they say, we took a serious look at this, we brought in engineers, we costed out doing whatever you propose, and it's not feasible, then that might give them a case to say, to deny the First Nation appeal. First Nations do not have a veto on this.
We're going to do 2 more questions. I think Kevin's a little tired up there, so 2 more questions, that's it.
Hi, Kevin.
I don't know.
I'm in the back, right back here. Hi, my name is Asa. I'm a filmmaker.
Oh, stand up.
My name is Asa. I'm a filmmaker, earthling, Canadian father. Couple of things. I never heard you until yesterday morning, so thank you to the Green Party for putting out this information. I didn't know we had our own version of Al Gore in Canada, so I'm very thankful that we do. There's $6 trillion worth of fossil fuel reserves left in the ground, and apparently we cannot extract more than 1, so that's about a 1/6. I just want to know if that statistic rings a bell for you. Our global GDP is about 80 trillion, 90 trillion, and Earth provides double that for free every year, what we call ecosystem services or natural capital. It's mind-blowing how this has been played out. I don't know, I think we almost have to embrace the fact that we may not...
You have to get to a question.
I'm getting to a question.
Please.
How long do you think we have? If it's business as usual, my question is, if it's business as usual, things are so bad over the last couple of years, what are things looking like? How much time do we have, is my question.
The World Authority on Global Warming is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they do forecasting. And one of their forecasts they call business as usual, which means we don't do anything to reduce emissions. And they, by the middle of this century, if it's business as usual, we're into real global climate crisis. So hopefully we do better than business as usual. Your other figures on the trillions and so on, I can't comment on those, but it's absolutely clear that almost all the fossil fuel that's left in the ground has to stay there if we're going to protect this planet. And that's very bad news for the big fossil fuel companies, because those are their assets. And then, I'm going to stop there. One more question, I believe.
Really quick, how do the banks play into this? Specifically, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, how does the CIB play into this, the financing behind the scenes? My name is Joseph Roberts. I publish Common Ground. Help yourself to Common Ground on your way out, and keep sending us the information you find out. I also have a suspicion that the judge has a conflict of interest, and I think that should be looked into. The judge that convicted my son and the grandmothers and other people for standing up to protect the invalid.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. I can't comment on the judge. And your first question is, what are the role of the banks in this?
Yes,
Well, the banks are very tied into the oil industry. The oil industry in Canada is a huge industry. The banks love it. And so some of you, does the name Frank McKenna mean anything to you? So Frank actually makes a small appearance in my book, and I've met him. He's a very bright, very impressive guy. Frank is on the board of TD Bank, and from that position he has spoken in favor of the pipeline. What is less known is that Frank is also very closely tied to Canadian Natural Resources Limited. In fact, he was on the board. That's one of the largest oil companies in Canada. That illustrates the kind of links that are happening behind the scenes that are often not at all made public. We're going to end on a great note here. Do you want me to introduce Bill? Really, this guy needs no introduction. It's a huge honor for me to be on the same stage. Bill Henderson, one of Canada's all-time great songwriters and performers, is going to wrap up with a pretty
Thank you. And I just want to say that it's an incredible honor to be on the stage with Kevin. When I found out he was doing this tour, I put up my hand immediately and said, "Can I play it?" And I'm just so impressed with what he has done tonight. I think it's fantastic. Thank you, Kevin. We're gonna take back this country. We're gonna take back this land. We're gonna bring back our democracy and build Canada again. We're gonna take back this country. We're gonna take back this land. We're gonna bring back the heart and soul of Canada again. Haven't we had enough? Haven't we had our fill? Hasn't it been too long living on corporate time, feeding the bottom line? Yeah, but we know where we're going. We know what to do. We will stand together because our love is strong. It's gonna carry us on. We're gonna take back this country. We're gonna take back this land. We're gonna bring back our democracy and build Canada again. We're gonna take back this country. We're gonna take back this land. We're gonna bring back the heart and soul of Canada again. Yeah. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, from sea to sea, the shining sea, from deep blue lakes and rivers, from towering mountain peaks, over rolling hills and open plains, the voices ring. I hear the people sing, we're gonna take back this country. We're gonna take back this land. Sing along now. We're gonna bring back our democracy and build Canada again. We're gonna take back this country. We're gonna take back this land. We're gonna bring back the heart and soul of Canada again.
coming. The last thing that I was asked to mention is that there are books for sale, credit card only, but the bookstore will be selling them as well. But so there are books available if you want to pick them up. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed yourself.